For centuries, global power has not fallen when armies were defeated or capitals burned. It has fallen when trust quietly drained from the systems that made power possible in the first place. Long before banners were lowered, something more subtle occurred. Money stopped behaving as it once had. Trade began to reroute. Debts grew abstract. Confidence, once assumed permanent, became conditional. The pattern is old. It appears in empires separated by oceans and eras, repeating with such consistency that it is often mistaken for coincidence. A dominant system establishes a unit of account accepted beyond its borders. That unit becomes indispensable. Trade, savings, and contracts are built upon it. Over time, the issuing power discovers it can extract more than it produces. The system continues to function, not because it is healthy, but because no alternative yet exists. For years, sometimes decades, the imbalance deepens without consequence. Then the flow shifts. Merchants begin settling accounts elsewhere. Reserves are quietly diversified. New channels appear at the margins, dismissed as inefficient or symbolic. Official narratives remain confident. Markets remain liquid. Daily life continues uninterrupted. To most participants inside the system, nothing appears broken. In fact, it often feels more prosperous than ever. This is always the most dangerous moment. Historically, the transition never announces itself as collapse. It arrives as innovation, a new clearing mechanism, a new settlement structure, a new promise of neutrality, not framed as rebellion, but as efficiency, not as replacement, but as optionality. The old system remains in place, still dominant, still trusted, until it is no longer necessary. What follows is not panic, but math. When settlement no longer requires participation, leverage reverses. When reserves no longer need to be held, demand erodes. When confidence becomes fragmented, stability becomes expensive. The issuing power must choose between defending credibility or sustaining internal obligations. It can rarely do both. The system does not break all at once. It thins, it stretches, it distorts. Those inside the system continue to speak in the language of permanence. Those outside begin speaking in the language of design. This has happened before. It happened when silver roots shifted away from Iberia. It happened when sterling ceded settlement supremacy. It happened when gold convertibility quietly ended, not with collapse, but with agreement. Each time, the public explanation focused on circumstance. Each time, the underlying cause was structural. Incentives changed, trust moved, power followed. The defining feature is never the new system itself. It is the moment when participation becomes a choice rather than a requirement. Once that threshold is crossed, outcomes are no longer debated. They are calculated. And by the time most people realize they are living inside the pattern has already moved on without them. Systemic collapse, in reality, rarely resembles the dramatic images history later assigns to it. There are no sudden voids, no universal recognition that a line has been crossed. Instead, collapse unfolds as a gradual loss of coherence between effort and reward. The system still operates, transactions clear, institutions function. But the outcomes no longer justify the inputs. What once reinforced stability now quietly undermines it. The earliest stage begins with expansion that outpaces productive capacity. Credit grows faster than output. Complexity replaces resilience. The system becomes efficient but fragile, optimized for scale rather than durability. This phase is celebrated. Growth metrics improve. Consumption rises. The imbalance is invisible because confidence is still intact. Next comes monetary distortion. To sustain momentum, currency creation accelerates, decoupled from real productivity. This is not initially experienced as inflation or crisis. It appears as liquidity. Asset values rise. Financial engineering substitutes for innovation. Wealth concentrates where access is greatest, not where value is created. The system rewards proximity over contribution. The third stage is debt normalization. Borrowing ceases to be a temporary tool and becomes structural. Obligations roll forward indefinitely. Future growth is assumed, then required. Political and institutional incentives align around postponement. Reform becomes synonymous with risk. Stability is measured by the absence of disruption, not by underlying health. The fourth stage is incentive fracture. Productive sectors stagnate while speculative activity thrives. Labor loses purchasing power relative to asset holders. The promise that participation leads to advancement weakens. At this point, social strain becomes visible, but its source is misunderstood. Blame is personalized. Structural causes are abstracted away. Stage 5 is confidence diversification. This is not a collapse of belief, but a spreading of it. Actors begin hedging against the system rather than exiting it. Reserves are diversified. Trade routes multiply. Alternative settlement mechanisms appear. Officially, nothing has changed. Practically, loyalty has. The sixth stage is irreversibility. At this point, restoring balance would require losses that the system's stakeholders cannot accept. Monetary tightening threatens solvency. Fiscal restraint threatens legitimacy. The tools that once stabilized now destabilize. Choices narrow. Delays compound costs. The final stage is redefinition. The old system continues to exist, but no longer sets terms. It becomes one option among many. Power diffuses. Standards fragment. Collapse in this sense is not destruction, but displacement. What makes this pattern enduring is not ignorance or malice. It is alignment. Each stage is rational for individuals within it. Each decision postpones pain while increasing scale. No single moment feels fatal. No single actor appears responsible. And because collapse begins economically, long before politics or conflict, it is often mistaken for evolution until the moment evolution demands a reckoning that cannot be deferred. The Roman Empire did not fall from a single blow. It exhausted itself from within long before its borders failed. At its height, Rome possessed unmatched structural advantages: a unified legal system, roads that integrated trade across continents, a currency trusted from Britannia to the Levant. For centuries, this architecture allowed Rome to extract value efficiently, project authority, and maintain order across vast distances. Expansion was the engine. Conquest brought spoils, labor, and tribute. These inflows masked internal weaknesses and funded public loyalty. As long as new territories were absorbed, the system remained liquid. Productivity mattered less than reach. Rome did not need to optimize internally because growth arrived externally. That balance eventually reversed. As expansion slowed, costs did not. Maintaining borders became more expensive than extending them. Military spending rose while returns diminished. To bridge the gap, Rome altered its money. Silver content in the denarius declined steadily over time. This was not initially perceived as debasement, but as flexibility. The currency still circulated. Prices adjusted unevenly. Those closest to the state benefited first. Debt followed. Obligations accumulated to soldiers, administrators, and suppliers. Taxation increased, but productivity did not. Small landholders were squeezed out, consolidating estates into fewer hands. Consumption remained high among elites while productive capacity hollowed out beneath it. Wealth flowed through Rome, funding spectacle and stability, but it no longer remained embedded in local output. The social consequences were subtle but corrosive. Participation no longer guaranteed security. Citizenship lost meaning as exemptions multiplied. Loyalty shifted from the system to survival within it. Barter returned at the margins. Local economies fragmented. Rome still ruled, but increasingly in name. Crucially, the empire responded rationally at every step. Debasement funded defense, taxation funded administration, price controls attempted stability. None addressed the structural imbalance between extraction and production. Each solution required greater force to sustain diminishing returns. By the time Rome faced external pressure, its internal coherence was already compromised. Trade networks had thinned. Confidence in currency varied by region. Authority depended on coercion rather than consent. The empire did not collapse when it was invaded. It collapsed when it could no longer convert power into prosperity. The final outcome was not uniform ruin, but transformation. The Roman system fragmented into regional structures better aligned with local incentives. The roads remained. The laws influenced successors. But Rome no longer set the terms. Wealth had passed through one of the most advanced systems in history and exited without anchoring itself permanently. The pattern was complete. And centuries later, another system, convinced of its uniqueness, would repeat it, under different conditions, with the same logic, and with equal confidence that this time would be different. In the early 20th century, the British Empire occupied a position strikingly similar to Rome's, though under vastly different conditions. It commanded global trade routes, controlled key financial choke points, and issued the world's primary reserve currency. Sterling was not merely money. It was infrastructure. Contracts, insurance, and international settlement depended on it. For generations, this dominance fostered a belief that Britain's financial primacy was a permanent feature of the global order. The confidence was understandable. London was the clearinghouse of the world. Capital flowed inward automatically. The empire could borrow cheaply, settle imbalances easily, and sustain consumption beyond domestic production. Like all dominant systems, Britain learned that credibility itself could be leveraged. The fracture began not with defeat, but with strain. 2 world wars forced unprecedented borrowing. To preserve stability, Britain suspended gold convertibility, then restored it at an overvalued rate. This decision was framed as discipline, a return to normalcy. In practice, it imposed deflationary pressure on an economy already weakened by debt and industrial decline. Productivity lagged while financial obligations mounted. Manufacturing lost competitiveness. Exports weakened. Yet sterling remained central to global reserves, allowing the system to persist despite its imbalance. This endurance reinforced the belief that Britain could manage its way through structural erosion with policy adjustments alone. Denial took institutional form. Warnings were treated as disloyal. Decline was discussed as cyclical rather than systemic. The empire still existed, the navy still patrolled, the currency still settled trade. But confidence, though outwardly intact, had begun to fragment. The turning point did not arrive as a crash. It arrived as an alternative. The United States, possessing unmatched productive capacity and creditor status, offered a parallel system. Dollar-based settlement expanded quietly. Reserves diversified gradually. Sterling's role diminished not because it failed outright, but because it was no longer singular. Britain attempted to defend the system. Exchange controls were imposed. Austerity followed. Each measure preserved short-term stability while accelerating long-term displacement. Maintaining the currency's status required sacrifices that eroded domestic legitimacy. The choice was no longer between strength and weakness, but between external credibility and internal sustainability. By the time sterling formally lost reserve dominance, the outcome was already irreversible. The empire persisted politically for years, but financially it had ceded its central function. The belief that history had granted Britain an exception proved misplaced. The same stages repeated. Expansion enabled leverage. Leverage masked imbalance. Imbalance demanded control. Control weakened confidence. Confidence sought alternatives. What made the collapse convincing, even to those living through it, was how orderly it appeared. There was no chaos, no singular breaking point, just a gradual realization that the system no longer set the terms it once enforced. The pattern did not change, only the instruments did. The modern global system was built on the assumption that efficiency and stability could be centralized indefinitely. A single settlement layer. A dominant reserve asset. Deep, liquid markets capable of absorbing global imbalances. For decades, this structure delivered undeniable benefits. Trade expanded, capital flowed freely. Risk was priced with confidence rather than caution, but the same structural forces visible in earlier systems are again at work. Global debt has grown faster than productive output. Monetary expansion has become a permanent feature rather than an emergency measure. Financial assets have appreciated far beyond the growth of underlying productivity. These conditions are not the result of mismanagement or ideology. They are the natural outcome of a system designed to defer adjustment. At the same time, incentives have begun to shift beyond the system's center. Large economies with persistent trade surpluses increasingly question why settlement, reserves, and sanctions exposure should remain tied to a framework they do not control. This is not ideological opposition. It is balance sheet logic. The emergence of alternative settlement mechanisms, particularly among BRICS nations, should be understood in this context. Digital currency initiatives, bilateral clearing arrangements, and commodity-linked settlement experiments are not attempts to overthrow the existing system. They are attempts to reduce dependence on it. Optionality, not rebellion, is the defining motive. Digitization matters not because it is novel, but because it lowers friction. Settlement that once required correspondent banking, dollar liquidity, and political alignment can now be routed through parallel rails. These systems do not need to be dominant to be consequential. They only need to be credible enough to be used at the margins. As history shows, confidence rarely collapses all at once. It disperses. The modern system still functions. Markets clear. Capital remains mobile. Official narratives emphasize resilience, depth, and adaptability. All of this is true. It is also beside the point. Systems do not fail when they stop working. They fail when participation becomes conditional. What is unfolding is not de-dollarization in the dramatic sense, nor an imminent replacement of global finance. It is a gradual redistribution of leverage. Each alternative settlement transaction slightly reduces the need for centralized trust. Each reserve diversification slightly weakens the assumption of permanence. The system remains dominant because it is still useful. But history suggests that usefulness, once shared, is rarely reclaimed. And as optionality expands, stability begins to depend less on confidence and more on control. That is the point at which late-stage systems appear strongest on the surface, even as their internal flexibility quietly disappears. Late-stage systems are defined by a peculiar calm. Volatility is contained. Institutions speak with confidence. Risk models extend familiar curves into the future. To participants within the system, instability appears manageable, even theoretical. This is not deception in the dramatic sense. It is normalization. As imbalances accumulate, institutions adapt by redefining what is acceptable. Higher debt becomes sustainable under new assumptions. Larger balance sheets are reframed as tools rather than liabilities. Intervention becomes routine. Each response succeeds just enough to justify the next one. Over time, the extraordinary becomes ordinary. Narratives harden in parallel. Stability is framed as proof of correctness rather than the result of constant support. Dissenting signals are labeled incomplete, outdated, or politically motivated. Warnings are not ignored. They are absorbed and neutralized. Risk is acknowledged in abstract, then dismissed in practice. This phase is reinforced by incentives. Those who benefit most from the system's continuation occupy decision-making positions. Short-term stability aligns with career preservation. Structural reform threatens incumbents long before it benefits the system. Delay is rewarded. Caution is interpreted as competence. Meanwhile, Exposure concentrates. Because the system has not failed, leverage increases. Hedging strategies assume liquidity will always be available. Correlations tighten. What appears as resilience is often dependence on the same underlying supports. The margin for error narrows, even as confidence remains high. Externally, alternatives mature quietly. They do not need to outperform the dominant system in efficiency or scale. They only need to function reliably under limited conditions. Each successful use case expands trust incrementally. Each bypass reduces systemic indispensability. By the time stress becomes visible, the options have already changed. The cost of adjustment is no longer measured in inconvenience, but in solvency and legitimacy. Actions that would have stabilized the system earlier now threaten to destabilize it. Tightening undermines debt. Expansion undermines credibility. Coordination becomes harder as interests diverge. This is why acceleration feels sudden. Not because deterioration begins late, but because recognition does. The system crosses from adaptive to brittle without ceremony. Small shocks produce disproportionate effects. Confidence, once diffuse, becomes binary. History shows that this moment is not marked by universal agreement. Some will insist nothing fundamental has changed. Others will argue the change occurred long ago. Both are correct in different ways. What matters is that the system's capacity to absorb strain has already been spent. From this point forward, outcomes are shaped less by intention than by constraint. The acceleration phase is not a crisis of imagination. It is a convergence of delayed consequences finally allowed to surface. History does not repeat because people fail to learn. It repeats because the structures that govern behavior outlast memory. Each generation inherits systems already in motion, with incentives already aligned, rewards already distributed, and costs already deferred. Individuals act rationally within these frameworks, even when the collective outcome becomes increasingly fragile. Economic systems do not collapse from villainy or incompetence. They erode when the mechanisms that once balanced effort and reward no longer do so, when trust becomes extractable, when confidence becomes leverage, when stability depends more on continuity than on correction. These are not moral failures. They are mechanical ones. The emergence of alternative monetary and settlement systems should be viewed through this lens, not as a sudden break, but as a familiar response to accumulated imbalance. When participation in a dominant framework becomes costly or constraining, actors search for optionality. They do not need to abandon the old system. They only need the ability to step outside it when necessary. This is why history's turning points rarely feel dramatic in the moment. They feel administrative, technical, rational. A new clearing arrangement here, a reserve adjustment there, each decision justified on its own merits. Taken together, they rewire the system beneath the surface. The lesson is not that any particular currency, institution, or alliance is destined to fail. The lesson is that no system remains central once it requires belief rather than utility to sustain it. Power endures when incentives align naturally. It dissipates when alignment must be enforced. What follows periods like this is not chaos, but reordering. New standards emerge, new centers form. The process is uneven and often misunderstood by those living through it. History later simplifies it into dates and declarations. But the real shift always occurs earlier, quietly, through accumulated choices that seem prudent at the time. Understanding this pattern does not grant control over it, but it does grant clarity. It allows observers to separate noise from structure, events from incentives, narratives from mechanics. That clarity has always been the first advantage available to those willing to look past reassurance and beyond alarm. If you're watching for the first time, welcome to the Economy Club. This is where we study the forces that shape history and the patterns that quietly decide the future. Stay curious, stay grounded, and we'll see you in the next cycle.